In Wyoming Territory, 1885, Sarah McKenzie's world crumbled just days before her wedding. As the most respected cowgirl in town, she had everything: a successful ranch, a loving fiancé, and the respect of her community. But when whispers of a hidden pregnancy spread through town like wildfire, her dreams shattered in an instant. Abandoned by her fiancé and shunned by those she called friends, Sarah faced the darkest days of her life. Then a mysterious cowboy rode into town, bringing with him a shocking discovery that would turn everything upside down. Could the truth he uncovered not only save Sarah's reputation, but also lead her to a love far greater than she ever imagined? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah McKenzie folded the crisp receipt from Madame Laurent's dress shop with trembling fingers, tucking it carefully into her father's old leather ledger. $250. More money than she'd ever spent on herself in one go. But Thomas had insisted. "No bride of mine is going to wear anything less than the finest," he'd said, his banker's pride showing through. The morning sun streamed through the ranch house windows, catching the silver handle of her mother's old hairbrush on the dresser. Sarah picked it up, running it through her chestnut hair as she studied her reflection. At 26, she was older than most brides in Whispering Pines, but that had never bothered her. She'd had a ranch to run after all. "Miss Sarah," young Jimmy's voice carried from the yard. "The new stallion's acting up again." Sarah grabbed her hat, muscle memory taking over as she pinned her hair up. The wedding dress could wait. Her ranch couldn't. Outside, the crisp autumn air carried the scent of sage and prairie grass. Workers were already moving through the corrals, their familiar morning rhythm as regular as a heartbeat. "Morning, Miss Sarah." Old Pete tipped his hat as she strode past. He'd been with the ranch since her father's time, staying on even after. The influenza took both her parents 5 years ago. Mr. Preston stopped by earlier, said he'd be back for supper. Sarah nodded, warmth spreading through her chest at the mention of Thomas. In just 3 days, she wouldn't be just Miss Sarah anymore. She'd be Mrs. Thomas Preston, wife to the most promising young banker in 3 counties. Yet she'd made it. Clear, marriage wouldn't change her role at McKenzie Ranch. Thomas had agreed, admiring what he called her pioneer spirit. The new stallion, a magnificent black Mustang they'd caught last month, was indeed causing trouble, testing the corral. Fence with powerful kicks. Sarah approached slowly, clicking her tongue in the way that usually settled nervous horses. "Easy there, Shadow," she murmured, using the name she'd given him. "No need for all this fuss." The horse's ears flicked toward her voice, but his eyes remained wild. Sarah had gentled dozens of horses over the years, earning a reputation as one of the best horse trainers in the territory. But this one had fight in him like she'd never seen. "He's got devil in him, Miss Sarah." Jimmy shuffled his feet nervously. "Maybe we should sell him to the army like Mr. Preston suggested." Sarah shook her head. "He just needs time." "Jimmy, sometimes the wildest spirits make the most loyal friends once they learn to trust." The morning passed in a blur of ranch work, mending fences, checking cattle, reviewing the books. Sarah had built McKenzie Ranch into one of the most successful operations in the county, expanding from her father's modest beginnings to over 2,000 acres. The townsfolk had whispered at first, doubting a woman could manage such an enterprise. But success had a way of silencing critics. As the sun began its westward slide, Sarah finally allowed herself to return to the house and think about the evening ahead. Thomas would be coming for supper, bringing his mother along to discuss final wedding arrangements. Mrs. Preston was particular about things being done properly. Sarah changed into her second-best dress, blue calico that brought out her eyes, and began preparing a roast her mother had taught her to make. As she worked, her gaze kept drifting to the ledger, where she'd stored the dress receipt. $250. The amount still made her stomach twist, but wasn't that what love was about? Compromise. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Thomas stood there, perfectly pressed despite the dusty street outside, his mother a picture of Eastern refinement beside him. "Sarah, darling," he smiled, pressing a proper kiss to her cheek. "Something smells wonderful." Mrs. Preston's nose twitched slightly as she surveyed the ranch house parlor. "I do hope you're planning to hire proper help after the wedding, dear. A banker's wife has certain social obligations." "Mother," Thomas warned softly, but Sarah caught the slight frown that crossed his face. Was he thinking the same thing? "The roast should be ready," Sarah said brightly, pushing down her unease. "Shall we eat?" Later, after their guests had gone, Sarah stood on her porch watching the stars emerge. The receipt in the ledger seemed to weigh on her mind. $250 for a dress she'd wear once. The same amount could buy 15 head of cattle, or repair the north pasture fence, or... She shook her head, smiling at her own foolishness. In 3 days, she'd be Mrs. Thomas Preston. The ranch would have all the capital it needed. Everything was falling into place exactly as it should. If only she'd known then that it was the last normal evening she would have for a very long time. If only she'd recognized the shadow of doubt in Thomas's eyes when his mother mentioned a banker's wife's obligations. If only she'd understood that sometimes the highest prices we pay have nothing to do with money at all. But that was tomorrow's trouble. Tonight, the stars wheeled overhead, the cattle lowed softly in their pastures, and Sarah McKenzie went to bed, believing she knew exactly who she was and where she was headed. Sometimes, the kindest thing fate does is let us keep our illusions, at least for one more night. The first whisper reached Sarah at Miller's General Store 2 days before the wedding. She was examining calico patterns with Thomas's mother when she noticed Mrs. Miller and her daughter Beth huddled behind the counter, their voices dropping to silence as Sarah glanced their way. It wasn't the silence that bothered her. It was the way they looked at her belly before quickly averting their eyes. "Perhaps the blue for new curtains," Mrs. Preston suggested, oblivious to the undercurrent. "Though I still think you should consider selling this ranch business once you're settled. The dust simply ruins good fabric." Sarah murmured something non-committal, her attention caught by Dr. Watson's wife entering the store. The woman's eyes widened upon seeing Sarah, and she immediately turned and hurried out. Despite the sign announcing a sale on sugar, something was wrong. By afternoon, the whispers had grown louder. Sarah felt them following her down Main Street as she headed to the dress shop for her final fitting. Women gathered in small clusters, conversations dying as she passed. Even Madame Laurent's usual effusive welcome seemed strained. "Is everything all right?" Sarah asked as the seamstress pinned her dress. "You seem—" "It's not my place to say," Madame Laurent replied stiffly. "Though I do hope you're being honest with young Mr. Preston." Sarah's stomach clenched. Honest about what? But the seamstress wouldn't meet her eyes. The walk home was interminable. Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece together the strange behavior, the whispers, the pointed looks. It wasn't until she passed Dr. Watson's office that clarity struck. Horrible, devastating clarity. The doctor's appointment book lay open on his desk, visible through the window. Sarah had never been inside that office, had no reason to. Yet somehow rumors were circulating that suggested otherwise. She burst through the door, startling the elderly doctor. "Dr. Watson, I need to know what people are saying about me." The doctor's face reddened. "Miss McKenzie, I cannot discuss other patients' conditions." "I am not your patient," Sarah's voice cracked. "I have never been your patient, so why is the whole town suddenly looking at me like—" Understanding dawned in the doctor's eyes. He pulled out his appointment book, flipping through the pages. "Miss McKenzie, there's no record of you visiting my office, ever, if someone is suggesting otherwise." But the damage was already done. By sunset, the rumors had taken solid form. Sarah McKenzie, the respected rancher's daughter, was with child, and not by her fiancé. Why else would she have hidden the doctor's visits? Sarah rode home in a daze, her world tilting on its axis. At the ranch, she found Thomas waiting on her porch, his face ashen. "Tell me it isn't true," he said, without preamble. "Of course it isn't true." Sarah fought to keep her voice steady. "Thomas, you know me. How could you even ask?" He ran a hand through his hair, distress evident in every movement. "Mother says, she says the whole town is talking. That you've been secretly visiting Dr. Watson, that you're in a delicate condition. I have never set foot in Dr. Watson's office. Look at his books, they'll prove it." Sarah, Thomas wouldn't meet her eyes. "Mother thinks perhaps we should postpone the wedding, just until this dies down." The world stopped. In that moment, Sarah saw everything with terrible clarity, saw how quickly trust could shatter, how easily reputation could crumble, how thoroughly lies could destroy truth. "If you believe these rumors," she said quietly, "then you never knew me at all." Thomas flinched but didn't deny it. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Sarah alone with the dying light and the weight of unfounded accusations. Inside her house, she found her father's old ledger, the wedding dress receipt still tucked inside. $250 for a dress she would never wear. But it wasn't the money that made her hands shake as she struck a match and held the receipt to the flame. It was the realization that sometimes the truth doesn't matter nearly as much as what people choose to believe. And in Whispering Pines, people had already made their choice. Sarah found the first torn wedding invitation on her front porch the next morning, ripped clean through the middle, the elegant script of her and Thomas's names separated by the jagged tear. By noon, similar fragments littered the streets of Whispering Pines like autumn leaves, a visible symbol of her public shame. She shouldn't have gone to town that day. Old Pete had offered to make the supply run for her, his weathered face creased with concern. But Sarah McKenzie had never hidden from anything in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. The whispers followed her down Main Street, louder now, emboldened by Thomas's apparent rejection. Outside the bank, Mrs. Preston stood with a cluster of society ladies, their faces masks of righteous disapproval. "Well, if it isn't the mother-to-be," Mrs. Preston's voice carried deliberately, "though I suppose we should be grateful you showed your true nature before you could disgrace our family name." Sarah's steps faltered, but she forced herself to keep walking. The general store was just ahead. If she could just get the supplies she needed. "Sarah," Thomas's voice stopped her cold. He stood in the bank's doorway, his banker's suit pristine, his face a storm of emotions. Behind him, Sarah could see his fellow bankers watching, along with what seemed like half the town. "Thomas, please," she said quietly. "Not here." But he was already striding toward her, brandishing a torn wedding invitation. "When were you going to tell me? Were you just going to let me marry you, pretending the child was mine?" "There is no child," Sarah's voice cracked. "Thomas, you know me. We've known each other since we were children. How can you believe these lies?" "Dr. Watson has never treated me." "Check his records, Thomas. Please, just check." "Enough." Mrs. Preston's sharp voice cut through their exchange. "Thomas, remember your position. The bank can't afford a scandal." Sarah watched the man she loved straighten his spine, saw him choose his reputation over their shared history. When he spoke again, his voice was cold, formal. "The wedding is cancelled. I'll expect you to make a public statement taking full responsibility to spare both our families further embarrassment." The crowd that had gathered seemed to hold its collective breath. Sarah felt the weight of their judgment, their eagerness for her humiliation. She thought of the wedding dress hanging in her bedroom, of the receipt she'd burned, of all the compromises she'd been willing to make for this man. "No." The word came out stronger than she expected. "I beg your pardon?" Thomas blinked. "I said no." Sarah lifted her chin, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I will not claim responsibility for a lie. I will not confess to something I haven't done. And I will not beg for the love of a man who trusts gossip over the woman he claims to love." She pulled her own copy of the wedding invitation from her pocket, the one she'd been carrying close to her heart, and deliberately tore it in half. "You want a public statement, Thomas? Here it is. The wedding is indeed cancelled, not because I'm carrying a child, but because I've finally seen the truth about the man I almost married." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah turned to face the gathered crowd, meeting their stares one by one. "You've all known me my entire life. I've done business with you, worshipped beside you, celebrated and mourned with you. Yet you'd rather believe a malicious lie than ask me for the truth." Her voice shook but didn't break. "Well, keep your judgment, keep your whispers. I have a ranch to run." She walked away then, head high, dropping the torn invitation pieces behind her like breadcrumbs, marking her path away from the life she'd planned. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Preston's indignant huffing, Thomas's embarrassed attempts to smooth things over with the bank officials, the renewed buzz of gossip. But it was old Pete's voice that finally broke her composure. He'd been waiting with the wagon, witness to everything, and as she passed him, he said quietly, "Your father would have been proud, Miss Sarah." She made it all the way back to the ranch before the tears came. There, in the privacy of her father's study, she pulled out the family Bible where she'd pressed a pristine wedding invitation, saving it as a memento. With trembling fingers, she removed it and added it to the fire, watching as the flames consumed what was left of her dreams. Tomorrow she would face the world again. Tomorrow she would be strong. But tonight, Sarah McKenzie allowed herself to mourn, not just for the love she'd lost, but for the innocent trust in human nature that had died with it. The ranch account books told the story better than words ever could. Sarah stared at the columns of neat figures, watching as ink struck through once reliable contracts. The Wilsons had cancelled their entire horse order. The Prescott family had withdrawn their cattle from her grazing lands. Even the army contract for hay, one she'd held for 3 years running, had been quietly reassigned. "They can't do this," Jimmy said, his young face twisted with confusion as he watched Sarah. "Update the books. It ain't legal." "They can and they are." Sarah's pen scratched across the paper, calculating their shrinking resources. "No one wants to do business with a woman of questionable character." The morning's mail had brought 5 more cancellations, each wrapped in polite language that did nothing to disguise their true meaning. The merchants in town had started requiring cash up front for supplies, no credit extended. Even the feed store, where she'd traded for years, suddenly couldn't risk their long-standing arrangement. Old Pete cleared his throat from the doorway. "Miss Sarah, about the men." She looked up, already knowing what he'd say. 3 ranch hands had quit that morning, mumbling excuses about family obligations while avoiding her eyes. They'd all been good workers, men who'd taken orders from her without question for years. Until now. How many are left? "Just me and Jimmy, miss. And well," Pete twisted his hat in his hands, "some of the others been asking about their wages, wanting to be paid up through next month, just in case. Just in case the ranch failed. Just in case the rumors were true. Just in case." Sarah opened her father's old strongbox, counting out the remaining cash. Not enough, not nearly enough, if everyone demanded advance payments. The bank account was closed to her now. Thomas had seen to that, citing community concerns about her judgment. "Pay them what they're owed for work done," she said finally. "Nothing more." When Pete left, Sarah turned back to the books, the numbers swimming before her eyes. The ranch had survived drought, harsh winters, and market downturns. But this was different. This was a drought of trust, a winter of isolation, a downturn of the human heart. Outside her window, she could see the new stallion's shadow, still testing his fence. Something in his defiant stance spoke to her now. They were both trapped by circumstances beyond their control, both fighting against constraints they hadn't chosen. Jimmy's voice broke into her thoughts. "Miss Sarah, that fancy horse dealer from Cheyenne is here, says he'll take shadow off our hands, offering cash." Sarah watched the stallion pace, remembering her words about wild spirits and loyalty. The offer was tempting. They needed the money desperately, but selling him felt too much like surrendering to the town's judgment. Tell him Shadow's not for sale. But Miss Sarah, some things are worth more than money, Jimmy. She turned back to her accounts, adding figures that refused to balance. We'll find another way. Later that night, after Jimmy and Pete had gone home, Sarah sat alone in her father's study. The account books lay open before her, their stark figures illuminated by lamplight. She traced her finger over her father's handwriting in the oldest ledgers, remembering how he'd taught her to run the ranch's business. "The numbers don't lie, Sarah girl," he'd always said. "They tell you straight what you need to know." Right now, the numbers were telling her she had maybe 3 months before everything her family had built would collapse. 3 months to prove her innocence, save her ranch, and rebuild her life from the ashes of scandal. Sarah closed the books and walked to the window. The moon cast Shadow's corral in silver light, the stallion's coat gleaming like polished onyx as he moved. He'd stopped testing the fence, she noticed, but his head was still high, his stance proud despite his confinement. Tomorrow would bring new cancellations, more turnbacks, deeper isolation. But tonight, watching that proud, unbowed stallion, Sarah felt something stir in her heart, something that felt almost like hope, or maybe it was just the first ember of anger waiting to become a flame. The stranger rode in on a dusty afternoon when the sun hung low enough to paint the mountains gold. Sarah was in the corral with Shadow, who'd finally started responding to her gentle training methods when she heard the approaching hoofbeats. The rider sat his horse with easy grace, his dark duster coating him in road dust. Nothing remarkable about that. But it was the way he studied the ranch that caught her attention, methodical, assessing, like a man who made his living noticing things others missed. "Miss McKenzie?" His voice carried across the yard, pleasant but professional. "Might I have a moment of your time?" Sarah's hand tightened on the corral rail. These days, strangers rarely brought good news. "State your business." He dismounted, smoothly, reaching into his coat. Sarah tensed, but he withdrew only a small card, offering it with a slight bow that managed to seem both courteous and slightly ironic. The card was simple, elegant. Matthew Hayes, Private Investigations and Discreet Inquiries. Denver, Colorado. Private investigator? Sarah's throat tightened. "If Thomas Preston sent you..." "Mr. Preston didn't send me." Hayes's green eyes held steady. "In fact, he'd prefer I wasn't here at all." Something in his tone made Sarah look closer. Hayes wasn't what she'd expected in a private investigator. No shifty eyes or false smile. Just calm confidence and, she was surprised to note, a hint of genuine concern. "Come inside," she said finally. "I assume you take coffee." In her father's study, Hayes declined the offered chair, instead moving to examine the family photographs. On the wall. "You've lived here your whole life?" "Since the day I was born." Sarah poured coffee into her mother's best cups, an act of defiance against recent events. She wouldn't let scandal reduce her to serving a guest in common mugs. "But you already knew that, didn't you?" Hayes accepted the cup with a slight smile. "I make it my business to know things, Miss McKenzie. For instance, I know you've never visited Dr. Watson professionally. I know Thomas Preston's bank has recently acquired 3 foreclosed ranches at suspiciously low prices. And I know," he paused, sipping his coffee, "that you're not the first woman in this territory to face sudden, devastating rumors just before a convenient property sale." Sarah's cup clattered in its saucer. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, Miss McKenzie, that pregnancy rumors are an effective way to pressure a woman to sell land cheaply, especially when that woman's fiancé happens to work for a bank with expansionist interests. Thomas wouldn't..." But even as she spoke, Sarah remembered his mother's constant hints about selling the ranch, the bank president's 2 casual inquiries about her property lines. Hayes set down his cup and withdrew a leather notebook. 3 months ago in Clearwater, a young widow faced similar accusations. She sold her ranch for a fraction of its worth and left town. 6 months before that, in Red Rock, he flipped pages. Same pattern, same result. "And you think this is all about my land?" Land, Miss McKenzie, is the only thing they're not making more of. Hayes's voice was gentle. Your ranch sits on the proposed railway route. That makes it valuable to certain interests. Very valuable. Sarah stood abruptly, moving to the window. Shadow was visible in his corral, his black coat catching the last sunlight. Why are you telling me this? What do you want? Justice, Miss McKenzie, and perhaps, she heard him step closer, perhaps a chance to stop this pattern before it ruins more lives. She turned to face him. Why should I trust you? Hayes withdrew another card from his coat, identical to the first, but for a slight tea stain in one corner. Because Martha Whitfield trusted me. The widow from Clearwater. I was too late to help her. I don't intend to be too late again. Outside, a wind was rising, carrying the first hint of evening coolness. Sarah studied the man before her, his steady gaze, his careful distance, the way he stood as if ready to accept either trust or rejection with equal grace. If what you're saying is true, she said slowly, we're dealing with powerful men who've done this before. Men who know how to cover their tracks. Hayes smiled then, a real smile that transformed his serious face. True, but they've never dealt with Sarah McKenzie before, have they? The Whispering Pines Herald from 6 months ago lay between them on Sarah's kitchen table, its yellowed pages carefully smoothed flat. Hayes's finger traced down a column of social notices, stopping at a particular entry. Here, he said, notice about the Whitfield property sale. Local widow makes generous gesture, selling historic ranch to progress. His lip curled slightly. They didn't mention the rumors that drove her to it. Sarah leaned closer, scanning the surrounding articles. Something about the writing style. The society columns. They're all signed Lady Observer. Just like the ones that first hinted at your condition. Hayes's eyes met hers. Mrs. Preston writes them. Sarah's hands clenched. She's been the Herald's society columnist for years. The kitchen was quiet, except for the ticking of the old clock and the distant sound of Pete and Jimmy. Working with the horses, morning light streamed through the windows, catching dust motes in its beam. Sarah had been up since dawn, her mind racing with possibilities after a sleepless night. Show me the other papers, she said, the ones from Red Rock and Clearwater. Hayes pulled them from his satchel. 3 small-town papers, 3 different dates, 3 stories of women and scandal. But as they laid them side by side, patterns emerged, not just in the events, but in the words used to describe them. The phrasing, Sarah murmured, reading aloud. A shocking development in respected circles. Community standards must be maintained. Banking institutions require utmost propriety. She looked up. These could have been written by the same person, because they were. Hayes produced another document, a letter on banking letterhead. Compare the handwriting. Mrs. Preston has been corresponding with editors across the territory. Sarah felt cold despite the warm morning. She's been doing this systematically, planning it. But why? She already has money, position. Some people hunger for more than they have, no matter how much that is. Hayes's voice was quiet. The railway's coming, Miss McKenzie. Land prices will triple, quadruple. For someone with inside knowledge of where the line will run. A knock at the door interrupted them. Jimmy burst in, his young face flushed. Miss Sarah, Mr. Thomas is riding up with some men from the bank. Hayes moved swiftly, gathering the papers. Your back door? Through the kitchen. Sarah was already moving. Jimmy, stall them. Ask about their horses. You know how bankers love to talk about their expensive mounts. She led Hayes through the kitchen and out the rear entrance. He paused at his horse, tied discreetly behind the house. I need to telegraph some contacts in Denver. There are records there, bank transfers that might prove the pattern. How long? 2 days, 3 at most. He swung into his saddle. Be careful, Miss McKenzie. Knowledge makes you dangerous to them now. You too, Mr. Hayes, she managed. A small smile. I'd hate to have to rescue you. He tipped his hat, a glint of answering humor in his eyes, then rode out behind the barn just as voices approached from the front of the house. Sarah smoothed her skirts and took a deep breath. When she walked into her parlor, Thomas and two bank directors were waiting, Jimmy hovering nervously nearby. "Sarah," Thomas's voice was stiff, "these gentlemen are concerned about your loan payments." "Are they?" She met his eyes steadily. "How interesting that the bank's concern comes just after I refuse to sell." One of the directors, Collins, she remembered, cleared his throat. "Given recent events, the bank must protect its interests. We're prepared to be generous in our purchasing offer." "No, I beg your pardon?" "I said no." Sarah moved to her father's desk, running her hand along its smooth wood. "This land isn't for sale. Not now, not ever. Be reasonable." Thomas stepped forward. "You can't manage alone. The rumors. Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Tell me, Thomas, does your mother still enjoy writing the society column? She has such a distinctive style." The flash of fear in his eyes told her everything. She pressed her advantage. "I wonder what the good people of Whispering Pines would think if they knew about Martha Whitfield, or the other women, the other ranches." Thomas went pale. Collins and the other director exchanged sharp glances. "I think you should leave now." Sarah's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "And you can tell your mother, Thomas, that her next column might be more interesting than she planned." After they left, Sarah sank into her father's chair, trembling but triumphant. Through the window she could see Shadow in his corral, head high, testing the wind. Like him, she could smell change coming. Now she just had to survive the storm. The land deed documents spread across Sarah's kitchen table told a story of greed, written in legal language and faded ink. Hayes had returned late the previous night, his saddlebags heavy with evidence from the Denver land office. "Look at the pattern," he said, arranging the deeds chronologically. "Every property sold under pressure was bought by different shell companies. But trace the ownership." His finger followed a line of signatures. "They all lead back to one holding company. Guess who sits on the board?" Sarah didn't need to guess. The Prestons, Thomas and his mother, along with 3 bank directors. Hayes pulled out another document, and this is the proposed railway route filed last year. Notice how it runs straight through every property they've acquired. Sarah felt sick. All those women, all those lives disrupted, just to buy land. At pennies on the dollar before the railway announcement went public. A knock at the door made them both freeze. But it was only old Pete, his weathered face grave. "Miss Sarah, you need to see this." He handed her a fresh copy of the Herald. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore." The front page carried a notice of foreclosure proceedings against McKenzie Ranch, citing irregularities in the loan arrangements. Below it, in the society column, Mrs. Preston had outdone herself. Sources close to the family express concern for the mental stability of certain property owners, clinging to outdated ways of life. "They're moving faster than I expected," Hayes muttered. "Your threat rattled them." Sarah crumpled the paper. "Good," but Hayes looked troubled. "They're powerful people, Miss McKenzie, connected all the way to the territorial governor. Maybe if we took this to the federal authorities." "And how long would that take?" Sarah straightened the deeds with sharp movements. "Weeks? Months? They'd have my ranch by then." "Miss Sarah," old Pete cleared his throat. "There's something else. Young Jimmy was in town this morning. Overheard some men talking at the saloon. Hired guns, by the sound of it. They were asking questions about the ranch. About you." Sarah met Hayes's concerned gaze. "They're not just trying to take my land anymore, are they?" "No." His hand moved unconsciously to his gun. "They're trying to silence you." Outside, a wind had risen, carrying the first hint of storm clouds. Sarah walked to the window, watching dust devils dance. Across her land, 5 generations of Mackenzies had worked this soil, built this life. And now some banking family thought they could steal it all with whispers and threats. "Mr. Hayes," she turned back to him. "How good are you with a gun?" "Good enough." His eyes narrowed. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's time to change. The game." She picked up Mrs. Preston's latest column. They've been using secrets and shadows to hurt people. Maybe it's time those secrets saw the light. That's dangerous, Miss McKenzie. More dangerous than waiting for their hired guns. She shook her head. They want to play with rumors? Fine. Let's give them something real to talk about. Hayes studied her for a long moment, then smiled slightly. I was wrong, you know. About what? When I said they'd never dealt with Sarah McKenzie before. He gathered the deeds carefully. I should have said they'd never dealt with Sarah McKenzie and Matthew Hayes before. The way he said it, linking their names, made something flutter in Sarah's chest. But there wasn't time for that now. Not with storm clouds gathering, both real and metaphorical. Pete, she turned to her old friend. Ride out to the Watson place. The doctor needs to know what his records are about to be used for. Mr. Hayes and I have some documents to organize. As Pete left, Hayes caught her arm. Gently. Sarah. It was the first time he'd used her given name. Are you sure about this? Once we start... They started this, she said quietly, when they tried to take everything I love. I'm just going to finish it. Thunder rumbled in the distance as they bent over the documents, piecing together the evidence that would expose a conspiracy built on broken lives and stolen dreams. Sarah felt something she hadn't felt since the rumors began. Purpose, hope. And if that hope was tangled up with the way Matthew Hayes's shoulder brushed hers as they worked, well, that was a complication she'd deal with later. The letter arrived with the evening shadows nailed to Sarah's front door. No envelope, no pretense at civility, just rough paper and cruder words. Drop it now. Next warning won't be on paper. Hayes studied the note in the lamplight, his jaw tight. Professional work. They're not hiding their intentions anymore. Sarah took the paper from him, the rough edges scratching her fingers. Good. I'm tired of dealing with snakes that won't show their fangs, but her bravado faded when she heard Jimmy's shout from the barn. They rushed out to find smoke rising from the hay storage, not much yet, but enough to send a clear message. You get the buckets! Sarah was already running. Pete, the water barrel! They formed a chain, passing buckets with desperate speed. The fire was small, deliberately set to warn rather than destroy. They had it out quickly. But the meaning was clear. Next time would be worse. Hayes pulled Sarah aside once the danger was past. You should leave just for a while until I can... No. She cut him off, smoke-stained and fierce. This is exactly what they want, what they've done to every other woman they've targeted. I won't run. Sarah, his voice softened, and she felt the warmth of his hand on her arm. You're not running. You're being strategic. The only strategy I'm interested in is exposing them. She pulled away, but gently. We're close, Matthew. I can feel it. He looked like he wanted to argue, but a horse's whinny interrupted them. Shadow was agitated in his corral, sensing the lingering smoke and tension. Sarah went to him automatically, murmuring soft words until he settled. He's not fighting the fence anymore, Hayes observed, coming up beside her. No, Sarah smiled, slightly. He's learned there are better ways to show strength, like his mistress. The question hung in the evening air, heavy with meaning. Sarah turned to face Hayes, really looking at him in the fading light. The worry in his eyes wasn't just professional concern anymore, and they both knew it. Mr. Hayes, she kept her voice steady. Are you letting personal feelings cloud your judgment? Would it matter if I was? Before she could answer, Pete's voice carried from the house. Miss Sarah, riders coming. They moved quickly to the porch, Hayes's hand near his gun. But it was Thomas, who emerged from the gathering dark, riding alone. Sarah, he dismounted awkwardly, looking uncertain. I came to warn you. Mother, she's arranged something. Tomorrow's paper, another scandal? Sarah's laugh was bitter. Or just more threats about my mental stability. You don't understand. She's desperate. The railway announcement goes public next week. If word of the land scheme gets out before then a lot of powerful people would face uncomfortable questions. Hayes stepped forward. Including you, Mr. Preston. Thomas flinched. I didn't know about the other women. Not at first. But you knew about me. Sarah's voice was ice. You let them destroy my reputation. Were you ever going to tell me the truth? I wanted to protect you. If you just sold the ranch quietly. Protect me? Sarah stepped into the lamplight, letting him see her smoke-stained dress, her hard eyes. Look around, Thomas. Look what your protection has brought. A sound in the darkness made them all turn. But it was just Shadow, pacing his corral in the gathering night, his coat gleaming like spilled ink. The hired guns, Thomas said quietly. They're not just for show. Mother's arranged. You have to leave, Sarah. Tonight. Hayes moved closer to her, his presence solid and reassuring. Or what, Mr. Preston? Or I won't be able to stop what's coming. Thomas mounted his horse clumsily. For God's sake, Sarah, please. They watched him ride away, his figure swallowed. By darkness, Hayes turned to Sarah, his face grave. He's right about one thing. Tomorrow's going to bring trouble. Sarah looked at the threatening letter, still clutched in her hand. Then we'd better work fast tonight, because tomorrow would bring more than trouble. It would bring a reckoning long overdue. Sheriff Wilson's report lay unfinished on his desk, the ink still wet. Disturbance at McKenzie Ranch. Property damage reported. No suspects identified. Below that, a list of incidents growing longer by the day. Cut fence lines, scattered cattle, mysterious night riders. That's all you're going to do? Sarah stood before his desk, Hayes a solid presence beside her. They're escalating, Sheriff. You know they are. The sheriff wouldn't meet her eyes. Miss McKenzie. Without proof. Proof. Hayes placed photographs on the desk, the burned hay, the cut fences, hoofprints by the corrals. Or do you mean permission? From the bank, perhaps? Wilson's face reddened. Now see here. No, you see here. Sarah leaned forward. Last night, 3 men tried to stampede my cattle. The night before, someone shot at my ranch hands. How many incidents? Does your report need before you'll act? A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they watched Thomas Preston and his mother enter the bank across the street, followed by men Sarah didn't recognize. Hard-faced strangers with well-worn gun belts. More business associates, Sheriff? Hayes's voice was dangerous. Wilson shuffled papers nervously. I can't interfere with legitimate business. Legitimate? Sarah's laugh was sharp. Like the legitimate business that drove Martha Whitfield from her land? Or Eleanor Hayes from hers? Hayes turned to her sharply. Sarah saw understanding dawn in his eyes. Why this case meant so much to him. She hadn't known, but somehow she wasn't surprised. This conspiracy had hurt too many people. My sister, he said quietly. Eleanor was my sister. The rumors killed her in the end. The shame, the loss, his hands clenched. I've been tracking this pattern ever since. The sheriff looked between them, uncertainty crossing his face. The Preston family has always been careful. Hayes's smile was cold. Yes, they have. But everyone makes mistakes, Sheriff. And we've found theirs. As if to punctuate his words, gunshots rang out. They rushed outside to find Shadow's corral fence splintered, the stallion racing for freedom as riders spurred away laughing. Still, need proof? Sarah's voice shook with fury, but Shadow hadn't run far. He circled back, watching the riders with ears pinned, then trotted to Sarah like he'd finally chosen his side. The sheriff stared at the retreating riders, then at his unfinished report. Something seemed to shift in his face. Tell me everything, he said. Inside his office they laid out the evidence. Land deeds, newspaper clippings, banking records. The pattern was undeniable once you knew where to look. The railway announcement, Sarah explained. It's coming next week. They needed my land. All our lands before then, before the prices soar. And the rumors, Wilson looked sick. The targeted women? Easier to pressure a woman alone, Hayes said quietly, especially once you've destroyed her reputation. Thunder rolled outside as Sarah watched understanding dawn on the sheriff's face. He was a decent man, she thought, just one who'd looked away too long. I'll need time, Wilson said finally. To verify, to gather support. Time is one thing we don't have. Hayes nodded toward the bank. "Those men they brought in? They're not here for show." Sarah touched the sheriff's report, her fingers tracing the list of escalating incidents. "Tomorrow's paper will carry more lies about me, about all of us. And then they'll come in force," Hayes finished, "to protect the community from the dangerous woman." "Very neat, very legal," Wilson straightened. "I can post deputies. They'd just be caught in the crossfire." Sarah shook her head. "No, we need to end this tonight, before anyone else gets hurt." Outside, the storm was building, lightning flickering between heavy clouds. Sarah watched. Mrs. Preston emerged from the bank, her face triumphant as she spoke to the armed men. "Matthew," she rarely used his first name, "your sister. Did she ever consider fighting back?" "She never got the chance." His eyes met hers. "But you're not Eleanor." "No, she wasn't. She was Sarah McKenzie, and she was done being a victim of other people's greed." "Sheriff," she said quietly, "I think it's time to finish that report. And then I have a story to tell you about some railway shares and the people who'd killed to keep them secret." The confession letter arrived in an unexpected way, handed to Sarah by Mrs. Collins herself, the bank director's wife, her hands shaking as she stood on the ranch house porch in the gathering dusk. "I can't sleep anymore," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "The things they've done, the lives they've ruined. Margaret Preston called it necessary business decisions, but I was there when they planned it all." Sarah unfolded the pages, Hayes reading over her shoulder as Mrs. Collins's elegant handwriting revealed the ugly truth. "I, Elizabeth Collins, being of sound mind, do hereby attest that on the evening of March 15th, 1885, I witnessed Margaret Preston, Thomas Preston, and my husband James Collins devise their strategy for acquiring lands along the proposed railway route." The letter went on, detailing meetings, dates, and the careful selection of their targets. Always women, always alone, always vulnerable to scandal. "They chose them carefully," Mrs. Collins said, her voice hollow. "Women with no male relatives nearby, women who'd built something valuable. They called it clearing the path for progress." Hayes's hand found Sarah's shoulder, steadying her as she read the most damning section. Margaret Preston took particular pleasure in writing the society columns. She kept a list of potential targets, studying their weaknesses. Sarah McKenzie's wedding announcement was cause for celebration in their circle, not for the marriage itself, but for the opportunity it presented. "A woman in love," Margaret said, "is easier to break." Sarah's hands tightened on the paper. They planned it all, every detail. "Thomas argued against choosing you," Mrs. Collins added softly, "at first. But his mother, she can be very persuasive. And the railway shares they were promised." A horse nickered in the darkness, making Mrs. Collins jump. "I have to go. They can't know I was here, but—" She met Sarah's eyes. "My sister lives in Red Rock. She could have been next. I couldn't live with that." After she left, Sarah and Hayes sat at the kitchen table, the confession letter between them, its pages illuminated by lamplight. "This is it," Hayes said quietly. "With this and the land deeds, we can prove the pattern, show how they've been operating. But will it be enough?" Sarah stood, restless energy driving her to pace. "Mrs. Preston has friends in high places. The territorial governor himself owns railway shares." A new voice finished. They spun to find Thomas Preston standing in the doorway, his face haggard. "Through a series of shell companies, I can prove it." Hayes's gun appeared in his hand. "That's close enough." Thomas raised his hand slowly. "I'm not here to stop you. I'm here to help." "Why now?" Sarah demanded. "After everything you've done?" "Because I finally read the whole file about Eleanor Hayes." His eyes met Matthew's. "Your sister, she didn't just leave town, did she? After losing her ranch?" "No." Hayes's voice was ice. "She didn't. Mother said they all just moved away. Started fresh somewhere else. But they didn't, did they? The shame, the loss, it broke them. Like it was supposed to break Sarah." Sarah watched her former fiancé, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time. You grew a conscience, Thomas. I grew tired of being a coward. He reached slowly into his coat, producing a stack of papers. Railway shares, bank transfers, governor's correspondence, everything you need. Why should we trust? You, Hayes hadn't lowered his gun. Because tomorrow at noon, Mother plans to make her move. The hired guns, the concerned citizens she's rallied. They're coming for the ranch. And Sarah, his voice cracked. They're not planning to leave witnesses. Outside, thunder rumbled. Closer, Sarah moved to the window, watching lightning illuminate her land. Everything she'd built, everything she'd fought for, coming down to tomorrow's confrontation. Matthew, she turned to Hayes, can you get these documents to the federal marshal in time? He studied the papers Thomas had brought, mentally calculating. If I ride now, hard through the night. No, Thomas interrupted. Mother's men are watching the roads, but I have a telegraph operator who'll help, one who's sick of being afraid of the Prestons. Sarah looked between the two men, the one who had betrayed her, now seeking redemption, and the one who had fought beside her, offering everything without asking anything in return. Send the telegraph, she decided, but Matthew stays, because tomorrow, she smiled, and there was steel in it. Tomorrow, Mrs. Preston is going to learn what happens when you underestimate the women you try to break. The storm was almost overhead now, lightning turning night to day in brilliant flashes. In his corral, Shadow stood facing the wind, unafraid of its fury. Like horse, like mistress, Sarah thought. Some spirits couldn't be broken. They only grew stronger in the breaking. The town meeting minutes would later record it as a routine gathering to address community concerns. But everyone who was there knew it was nothing short of a war council, with Sarah McKenzie's ranch and life hanging in the balance. The town hall was packed by noon, summer heat making the air thick with tension. Mrs. Preston sat in the front row like a queen holding court, her expression serene as Sheriff Wilson called the meeting to order. "We're here today," the sheriff began, his voice carrying unusual strength, "to address serious allegations regarding property acquisitions in our territory. We're here," Mrs. Preston interrupted smoothly, "to discuss the dangerous delusions of a woman clearly unfit to manage her affairs." Her eyes found Sarah. "Really, dear, these wild accusations are documented fact." Sarah stood, Hayes beside her, Thomas hovering uncertainly near the back. "Shall we discuss the railway shares, Mrs. Preston? Or would you prefer to explain how so many women's reputations conveniently needed destroying just before their land was sold?" The town clerk's pencil scratched frantically, recording every word as the meeting erupted into chaos. Mrs. Preston's face hardened. "Arrest her," she commanded the sheriff, "for slander, for disrupting the peace, for telling the truth." Hayes stepped forward, producing copies of the evidence they'd gathered. "The federal marshal is already reviewing the originals. Would you like to explain these documents to him, or shall I?" Sarah watched the faces in the crowd as Hayes laid out their case, the pattern of rumors, the land grabs, the railway connection. She saw the moment understanding dawned, saw horror replace suspicion in their eyes. "It's lies." Mrs. Preston's voice rose. "All lies. I've worked for years to maintain standards in this community, like you maintain standards in Red Rock." Sarah's voice cut through the noise. "Ask her about Eleanor Hayes, everyone. Ask her what happened after they drove her from her land." "You're hysterical," Mrs. Preston snapped. "Thomas, explain to these people." But Thomas stood. "No, Mother. No more lies." He moved to join Sarah and Hayes. "It ends today." Mrs. Preston's mask cracked. She gestured sharply, and her hired guns moved toward the doors. "This meeting is over. Anyone spreading these ridiculous rumors will face consequences. Like Martha Whitfield faced consequences." Sarah pulled out Mrs. Collins's confession letter. "Your friend Elizabeth had quite a lot to say about your methods." The room went deadly quiet as Sarah read portions of the confession aloud. Even the hired guns shifted uncomfortably as the details of the conspiracy emerged. "You fool," Mrs. Preston hissed when Sarah finished. You think these peasants understanding anything about progress? About building something greater than their small minds can grasp? We understand greed, old Pete spoke from the crowd. Understand it right well. And we understand justice, Sheriff Wilson added, his deputies moving to block the doors. Mrs. Preston looked around the room, seeing her support crumbling. For a moment, something like fear crossed her face. Then she straightened, every inch the banking family matriarch. You have no proof that would stand in court, she said coldly, and by the time any marshal arrives, her eyes met Sarah's. Accidents happen, dear, especially on isolated ranches. Is that a threat, Mrs. Preston? Hayes's hand moved toward his gun. A prophecy, Mr. Hayes. Some of us are simply better suited to shape the future. The weak exist to make way for the strong. No, Mrs. Preston. Sarah's voice rang with authority. The weak exist to become strong, and I'm done making way for anyone. The town clerk's pencil had stopped moving, the man staring open-mouthed at the scene before him. In years to come, people would say this was the moment Whispering Pines changed, when a community finally saw the poison in its midst and chose to stand against it. But for Sarah, it was simpler than that. This was the moment she reclaimed not just her reputation, but her power. The moment she looked into the eyes of the woman who had tried to destroy her and saw not a queen, but a bully finally exposed to the light. Sheriff, Sarah said quietly, I believe Mrs. Preston just threatened my life in front of witnesses. Again, Wilson nodded. Indeed she did. He turned to his deputies. Ladies and gentlemen, this meeting is adjourned. Mrs. Preston, we have some questions for you down at the jail. But everyone knew this wasn't over. Not with Mrs. Preston's hired guns still in town. Not with so much money and power at stake. The real fight, Sarah realized as she met Hayes's worried eyes, was just beginning. The Whispering Pines. Herald's special edition hit the streets like a thunderbolt. For the first time in its history, the paper ran without a society column. Instead, splashed across the front page was a headline that would shake the territory. Banking family's land scheme exposed. Conspiracy of rumors. Threats used to seize railway properties. Sarah sat in her father's study, reading the article for the third time. The reporter, a young man who'd replaced Mrs. Preston as the paper's chief writer, had done his job well. Every detail was there, the pattern of false scandals, the targeted women, the railway connection, all laid out in clean, devastating prose. They're calling for a territorial investigation, Hayes said from the doorway. He'd been up all night, coordinating with the federal marshal's office. The governor's already trying to distance himself. And Mrs. Preston? Still in jail, despite her lawyer's best efforts, but her hired guns haven't left town. Sarah, finished. She'd seen them watching her ranch from the hills, waiting. A knock at the door made them both tense, but it was only Thomas, carrying more newspapers. Denver picked up the story, he said, dropping the papers on the desk. And Salt Lake City. It's spreading. Sarah studied her former fiancé. He looked older somehow, the weight of his choices evident in the new lines around his eyes. The bank directors are meeting, he continued. They'll try to save themselves by claiming Mother acted alone. I've been asked to resign. And the railway shares? Hayes asked. Worthless now. The government's investigating all the land deals. They'll likely relocate the route entirely. Thomas managed a bitter smile. Mother's empire, undone by the truth she tried to bury. A shot rang out, shattering the study window. Hayes pulled Sarah down as Thomas dove for cover. You were saying? Sarah's voice was steady, despite her racing heart. Mother's men, Thomas groaned. They won't let this end quietly. Good. Sarah crawled to her father's desk, pulling out his old rifle. I'm tired of quiet. Sarah, Hayes's voice held warning. We should wait for the marshal. They'll be gone by then. She checked the rifle's action. And I'm done letting others fight my battles. As if in response, they heard Jimmy's shout. From the barn, followed by old Pete's answering call, her people, her ranch, under attack because she dared to stand up to power. Matthew, she met his eyes. Are you with me? His answer was to draw his gun, checking the load. Always. Thomas stood awkwardly. I can try to talk to them. No, Sarah's voice was firm. You've chosen your side, Thomas. Now stay with it. Outside, more shots rang out, but these were answered by return fire. Sheriff Wilson and his deputies arriving just in time. Back door, Hayes commanded. We can circle around through the corrals. They moved carefully through the ranch yard, using outbuildings for cover. Sarah could see the hired guns now, their positions revealed by gun smoke. 6 men, professional killers, brought in to eliminate a problem. But they hadn't counted on Sarah having allies. Sheriff Wilson's men were pushing them back from the north. Hayes moved like a shadow, his experience evident in every precise shot. And Sarah felt oddly calm as she sighted down her father's rifle. These men had thought her an easy target. A woman alone, vulnerable to pressure and threats. Just like Eleanor Hayes, just like Martha Whitfield. But that's where they'd made their mistake. Because Sarah wasn't alone, and she wasn't broken. The firefight was brief but intense. When it ended, 2 of Mrs. Preston's men were dead, 3 wounded, and 1 in custody. None of Sarah's defenders had more than scratches. Federal marshals. On his way, Wilson reported, securing the prisoners. Should be here by sundown. Sarah surveyed her ranch in the aftermath. Bullet holes in the barn would need patching. The broken window would want replacing. But the land itself was unmarked, enduring as always. It's really over, Thomas asked quietly. Hayes shook his head. The investigation's just beginning. A lot of powerful people are going to face questions. Good. Sarah turned to face the rising sun, feeling its warmth like a promise. Let them answer for once, instead of women bearing the cost of their greed. The newspaper lay forgotten on her father's desk, its headline already becoming history. But its real story wasn't in the printed words. It was in the truth, finally brought to light. In the courage of those who stood against power, in the strength of a woman who refused to be broken. And perhaps, Sarah thought as Hayes's hand found hers, in the love that had grown in the midst of battle. The community apology letter arrived a week after the shootout, bearing the signatures of every prominent citizen in Whispering Pines. It was penned in the schoolteacher's careful hand, each word chosen to bridge the gulf that scandal had created. Dear Miss McKenzie, we, the undersigned citizens of Whispering Pines, write to express our deepest regret for our role in the injustice you suffered. In believing rumors without proof, in turning our backs on a neighbor in need, we failed not. Only you, but the very principles of community we claim to uphold. Sarah read the words aloud to Hayes as they sat on her porch in the evening light. He listened silently, watching her face as she reached the final paragraph. While we cannot undo the harm done, we can pledge to do better. To stand against injustice, to question malicious whispers, to defend those targeted by the powerful. Your courage in facing down the Preston conspiracy has taught us all a valuable lesson about truth and strength. Fine words, Hayes commented when she finished. But words are easy. Actions are harder, Sarah agreed, but her voice was thoughtful. Still, they're trying. Mrs. Miller brought bread yesterday. Beth Watson stopped by to help with the mending. Small gestures, but meaningful ones. Like the town was slowly waking. From a spell of suspicion and fear. The federal marshal says they found 3 more cases, Hayes added. Women in other territories who lost their land to similar schemes. They're reopening the investigations. Sarah stood, moving to where Shadow grazed peacefully in the yard. The stallion had earned his freedom after the shootout, but he chose to stay, as if understanding that freedom and loyalty weren't opposing forces. I've been thinking about Martha Whitfield, she said, about Eleanor. All the women who didn't have someone to stand beside them. Hayes came up behind her, his presence warm and solid. Sarah, we could help them, she turned to face him. You with your investigative skills, me with everything I've learned about fighting back. A new direction for both of us. His smile held understanding. Why not? The railway's coming, but not through our land now. Change is coming anyway, might as well make it change for the better. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas, carrying more papers from the investigation. He'd been working tirelessly to make amends, using his insider knowledge to unravel similar schemes across the territory. The governor's resigned, he announced without preamble, and Mother, she's agreed to testify about the other conspirators in exchange for leniency. Sarah absorbed this news, watching the sun set behind her mountains. Mrs. Preston's elegant world was crumbling, but something stronger was being built from its ruins. "Miss Sarah," Jimmy's voice carried from the barn, "that mare from the Watson place is foaling." Life went on. Even after scandal, after gunfights, after the rewriting of everything she'd thought she knew about her community. Animals needed tending, fences needed mending, and tomorrow would bring its own challenges. "Go on," Hayes nudged her gently. "I'll handle the paperwork." She caught his hand before he could step away. "Matthew, thank you for believing in me when no one else did." His fingers tightened on hers. "You believed in yourself, Sarah. That's what mattered." Thomas cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'll just go help Jimmy." When they were alone, Hayes pulled Sarah closer. "About that new direction you mentioned." "Yes, I think we should discuss it. Over dinner, perhaps." Sarah laughed, the sound free and clear in the evening air. "Mr. Hayes, are you courting me?" "Properly this time," he smiled. "No conspiracies, no gunfights, just a man asking a remarkable woman to consider a future together." Behind them, the community's apology letter fluttered in the breeze, its signatures a reminder that healing was possible, that communities could learn and grow. "Yes," Sarah said simply, "to dinner, to the future, to all of it. Because sometimes the greatest victory wasn't in winning the fight, but in what you built after the battle was done." And Sarah McKenzie had always been good at building things meant to last. The job offer from Chicago arrived on a crisp autumn morning, the elegant letterhead of Pinkerton's National Detective Agency stark against the cream envelope. Hayes held the letter loosely in his hands as he sat across from Sarah in her father's study, the weight of opportunity heavy between them. "Chief investigator for their land fraud division," he said quietly. "Everything we've been talking about doing, but with real resources, institutional backing." Sarah traced the embossed letterhead with one finger. Chicago. Yes, that single word carried worlds of meaning. Chicago meant leaving Wyoming, leaving the work they'd started here, leaving her. "It's a remarkable opportunity." Sarah kept her voice steady. "They obviously recognize your skills." "Our skills," Hayes corrected. "The offer, it mentions bringing you on as a consultant. Your experience with the Preston case, your understanding of how these schemes target women property owners." Hope flared briefly before reality doused it. "I can't leave the ranch, Matthew, you know that. We could hire managers. With the consulting fees, it's not about the money." Sarah stood, moving to the window. Outside, autumn painted her land in golds and reds, beautiful even in its fading. "This land is part of me, my family's legacy. I won't be an absentee. Owner giving orders from a city office." Hayes was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "And if I took the position, traveled back when I could?" Sarah closed her eyes against the pain of that image. "How well did that work for your sister? A husband always away, leaving her to face the vultures alone?" "You're not Eleanor." He came up behind her, not touching but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "You're stronger, and you wouldn't be facing vultures. The Preston conspiracy is finished. There will be others." Sarah turned to face him. "You taught me that. Men like them, they see land and opportunity, and they don't care who they hurt to get it. That's why our work here matters. It matters in Chicago, too. Think of how many women we could help with Pinkerton's resources while watching my land." "Through reports and telegrams?" Sarah shook her head. "I'd lose myself, Matthew, become something I'm not." The silence stretched between them, filled with everything they'd built together and everything that threatened to tear it apart. Hayes looked down at the job offer, his expression troubled. "I won't pressure you." he said finally. But Sarah, I need to consider it. This kind of opportunity, I know. She touched his cheek gently. And you should. You're brilliant at what you do, Matthew. You deserve every chance to grow. But I can't go with you, and I won't ask you to stay. He caught her hand, pressing it more firmly to his face. I haven't decided anything. Yes, you have. Sarah smiled sadly. I see it in your eyes, the excitement, the possibilities. Chicago is calling you, Matthew, and it should. Sarah! A commotion outside interrupted them. Jimmy burst in, his young face excited. Miss Sarah, Shadow's done it. That wild mare nobody could get near. He talked her right into the corral. You've got to see. Sarah and Hayes followed Jimmy, out to where the magnificent black stallion stood proudly beside a beautiful bay mare, both horses calm, despite the gathering crowd of ranch hands. Well, would you look at that, Hayes murmured. Seems Shadow's found his match. Yes, Sarah watched the horses, her heart aching. But he had to stay here to find her, didn't he? The Chicago letter seemed to burn in Hayes's pocket. Sarah could almost see the future splitting into two paths, one leading east to opportunity and growth, the other staying rooted in Wyoming soil. We don't have to decide today, Hayes said quietly, but they both knew they already had, just as they both knew that loving someone sometimes meant being brave enough to let them follow their dreams, even when those dreams led in different directions. Come to dinner tonight? Sarah asked, keeping her voice light. I want to hear all about Chicago, about the good you'll do there. Hayes's arms went around her, holding her close as they watched Shadow and his mare graze contentedly in the autumn. Son, I'll always come back, you know, however far I go. I know. Sarah leaned into his embrace, memorizing the feel of it. But we both know coming back isn't the same as staying. Above them, wild geese flew south for winter, their cries carrying both farewell and the promise of return. Sarah wondered if love was like that sometimes, a migration between what the heart wanted and what life demanded, each journey bearing its own kind of pain and beauty. The partnership agreement was Thomas's idea, born of his banker's mind and his need for redemption. He brought it to Sarah's ranch at dawn, the legal document carefully drafted to create something entirely new. A detective agency, he explained, spreading the papers on her kitchen table. Based here, at the ranch, using Hayes's connections with Pinkertons to build a network across the territories. Sarah studied the document, her eyes catching on key phrases. McKenzie and Hayes investigations, and specializing in land fraud and property rights protection. The ranch would be headquarters, Thomas continued. You'd maintain your home, your land, but you'd also have a base for investigating other cases. Hayes could work with Pinkertons from here, travel when needed. While I manage both businesses, Sarah's voice was thoughtful, the ranch and the agency. You already do both, Hayes spoke from the doorway where he'd been listening. Every case we've consulted on since the Preston affair, you've solved. While running this place, he was right. In the months since the conspiracy's exposure, they'd helped 3 other women fight similar schemes. Sarah had done the work between ranch duties, using her hard-won knowledge to spot patterns others missed. The railway's coming, Thomas added, but not through your land now. It'll stop in town, bringing more settlers, more opportunities, and more chances for fraud. People will need protection. Sarah walked to the window. The morning sun lit, her land in shades of promise, the autumn colors blazing against the sky. In the distance, Shadow and his mare grazed together, proof that wild spirits could find ways to balance freedom and commitment. Read page 3, Hayes said quietly. Sarah turned back to the agreement, finding the section he meant. Her breath caught at the elegant solution laid out in legal language. The agency would be equal partners, her land sense and Hayes's detective skills building something greater than either could achieve alone. He could still work with Pinkertons, but as their territorial representative, not an employee. He could travel when cases required, but always with a home and purpose to return to. It's not perfect. Hayes moved closer. I'd still be away sometimes. You'd have more responsibilities, but we'd be building something together. Sarah looked up at him. Something that could help others while protecting what matters to us both. Thomas cleared his throat. There's more. I've spoken to the bank board. They've agreed to extend credit for the agency's startup costs, part of their restitution for the Preston affair. Sarah almost laughed at the irony. The bank that had once tried to destroy her now helping fund her future. But that's how change worked sometimes. Yesterday's enemies became tomorrow's allies, if you were brave enough to let them try. The territorial governor's replacement is interested too, Hayes added. He wants to establish better protections for property owners. We could help shape those laws, Sarah. Make real changes. Sarah picked up a pen, turning it thoughtfully. You're both assuming I'll say yes. No, Hayes smiled. We're assuming you'll make the right choice for you, whatever that is. And that, perhaps, was why she loved him. He'd always believed in her strength to choose her own path. She looked down at the partnership agreement again, seeing not just legal words but a bridge between what her heart wanted and what life demanded. A way to keep her land, help others, and build a future with the man who'd stood beside her when all seemed lost. We'll need office space, she said finally. The old bunkhouse could be converted. Hayes's smile could have lit the dawn. Does that mean? Sarah dipped the pen in ink. It means, Mr. Hayes, that you should have considered a partnership months ago instead of trying to drag me to Chicago. Her signature was firm and clear beside the blank line awaiting his. As she wrote, she felt the rightness of it settle in her bones. This wasn't a compromise between two dreams. It was the creation of a new one, big enough to hold both their hearts. Now then, she stood, practical as always. We should discuss rates, cases, how to balance the work. Hayes pulled her close, silencing her with a kiss that held all the promise of their shared future. When they parted, Thomas had tactfully disappeared, leaving the signed agreement on the table like a bridge to tomorrow. Outside, the sun crowned the mountains with gold, painting the ranch in light that felt like benediction. Shadow nickered to his mate, and somewhere in the distance an eagle cried out in wild joy. The wedding announcement in the Whispering Pines Herald read differently than Sarah's first. No flowery society language or veiled implications. Just simple truth. Sarah McKenzie, owner of McKenzie Ranch and co-founder of McKenzie and Hayes Investigations, to wed Matthew Hayes, former Pinkerton detective and her partner in both business and life. The ceremony will be held at sunset on the ranch, where the couple will continue their work protecting land rights and investigating fraud across the territories. All are welcome to attend. Short and sweet, Hayes commented, reading over her shoulder. Though you forgot to mention how I fell in love with you while investigating a conspiracy. Hardly proper wedding announcement material, Sarah laughed, but her eyes were soft as she pinned the notice to her father's old bulletin board. The ranch had transformed in the month since they'd signed the partnership agreement. The old bunkhouse now housed their detective agency, its walls lined with maps and case files. A steady stream of clients found their way to their door. Women fighting land schemes, settlers facing fraudulent claims, honest folk needing champions who understood both the law and the land. Today, though, work had given way to wedding preparations. Lily Watson, the doctor's wife now firmly in Sarah's corner, had taken charge of decorating the barn for the celebration. It's not every day we get to celebrate a love story that brought down a conspiracy, she declared, directing Jimmy and Pete in hanging lanterns. Sarah watched from the doorway as her two worlds merged. Case files shared space with wedding gifts. Her father's old desk held both ranch ledgers and investigation notes, and everywhere people moved with purpose. Ranch hands and town folk, working together to prepare for tomorrow's celebration. Miss Sarah, Beth Miller hurried up, her arms full of flowers. The dress is ready. Would you like to try it on one final time? This wedding dress was different from the first. Practical, enough to ride in, but beautiful in its simplicity. Sarah had chosen it herself, using money earned from their first successful case. The territorial governor sent a gift, Thomas announced, bringing in a large package. Since joining their agency as a financial advisor, he'd found his own redemption in helping others avoid the schemes he'd once been part of. Inside the package was a hand-carved sign for their office, McKenzie and Hayes Investigations, defending truth, land, and justice. Better than bank work? Sarah asked him teasingly. Much, Thomas smiled. Mother wouldn't agree, but she's finding. Prison gives one a different perspective on things. The afternoon passed in a blur of final preparations. Sarah found moments of quiet joy in unexpected places. Hayes teaching Jimmy proper investigation techniques between hanging decorations, old Pete telling anyone who'd listen how he'd known all along these two were meant for each other. Beth and her mother planning to start a women's property rights group inspired by Sarah's example. At sunset, Sarah stood in her father's study, pinning her mother's cameo at her throat. The last light painted the room gold, catching the sign that would soon hang on their office. Your parents would be proud, Lily said softly from the doorway. Not just of the wedding, but of everything you've built. Everything we've built, Sarah corrected, thinking of how the whole community had transformed. Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air, and sometimes it takes one person brave enough to stand in that storm. Lily straightened Sarah's collar. You showed us all how to be braver. A commotion outside drew them to the window. Hayes had arrived for the rehearsal, and Sarah's breath caught at the sight of him. He moved through the crowd with easy grace, but his eyes searched for her as they always did. Their gazes met through the window, and Sarah felt the same spark that had grown from respect to love during their fight for justice. They had found each other in the midst of conspiracy and corruption, proving that sometimes the strongest bonds are forged in adversity. Ready for tomorrow? Lily asked. Sarah watched Hayes stop to help Jimmy with a stubborn lantern, saw the way her ranch hands treated him like family, noted how naturally he fit into this world they'd created together. I've been ready since he walked into my study with that first warning, she admitted. I just didn't know it then. Outside, Shadow and his mare grazed peacefully near the decorated barn, the stallion's wild spirit gentled but not tamed by love. Rather like Sarah herself, she thought with a smile. Well then, Lily handed her the bouquet for the rehearsal. Let's go practice getting you married to your detective. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new adventures, but tonight was for celebrating not just their love, but the triumph of truth over lies, of justice over greed, of two hearts finding their way to each other despite every obstacle thrown in their path. The McKenzie family Bible lay open on the study desk, its ancient pages turned to the family record section. Sarah's hand was steady as she made the new entry. October 15th, 1885, Sarah Elizabeth McKenzie and Matthew James Hayes joined in marriage. At sunset on McKenzie Ranch, witnessed by the community of Whispering Pines and sealed with love, trust, and a shared dedication to justice. Below this, she added a note that would have mystified her ancestors but felt right for their unique union. Founded McKenzie and Hayes Investigations, dedicated to protecting the land rights and dignity of those who might otherwise stand alone. Making it official? Hayes asked from the doorway, already dressed for their wedding. Just adding our chapter to the family story. Sarah closed the Bible carefully, though I doubt my great-grandmother ever imagined this version of a McKenzie marriage. I doubt she imagined her great-granddaughter facing down conspiracies and starting a detective agency either. True, Sarah smiled. But then every generation writes its own story. The afternoon sun streamed through windows that no longer needed to watch for threats. Outside, wedding guests were arriving. Not just the townfolk, but clients they'd helped, women they'd defended, even a contingent of Pinkerton agents Hayes had worked with. The governor's representative is here, Thomas reported, popping his head in. And you'll never guess who else. Martha Whitfield herself came all the way from California when she heard the Preston conspiracy had been exposed. Sarah's heart lifted at this news. Their work had already begun bearing fruit, with women reclaiming stolen properties and corrupt officials facing justice across the territory. "Miss Sarah!" Jimmy's excited voice carried from outside. "Shadows acting mighty strange!" They rushed to the window to see the stallion prancing proudly in his corral, showing off for the gathering crowd. His mare watched indulgently, their foal, born just weeks ago, frolicking nearby. "Not so wild anymore," Hayes observed. "No," Sarah agreed, "just free to be himself on his own terms, rather like someone else I know." Hayes pulled her close, careful not to wrinkle her dress. "Having second thoughts about marrying a wandering detective?" "Not one," Sarah met his eyes. "Because you're not wandering anymore. We're building something here together." A knock at the door revealed Lily, ready to help Sarah with final preparations. "It's almost time. And Sarah, there's something you should see first." She led them to the converted bunkhouse where their office was located. There, laid out on their desk, was a stack of letters that made Sarah's throat tight with emotion. Letters from women across the territory, responding to their wedding announcement with stories of their own battles for justice. Women seeking help, offering support, wanting to join their cause. "Seems you're not going to lack for cases," Thomas commented from behind them. "We never thought we would." Hayes picked up one of the letters. "That's why we're here, isn't it? To help write different endings to these stories." Sarah touched the family Bible she'd carried with her. "To make sure no one faces these battles alone." The sun was setting as Sarah walked toward the decorated barn on her father's land, Hayes waiting for her beneath an arch of autumn flowers. The gathered crowd represented everything they'd fought for: justice, community, the triumph of truth over deception. Old Pete was crying openly as he gave her away. Jimmy stood proudly as ring-bearer, his young face shining with admiration for the family he'd found here. The territorial judge who performed the ceremony spoke not just of love, but of partnership, courage, and the bonds that grow stronger through adversity. When it came time for the vows, Sarah and Hayes had written their own. "I promise to stand beside you in all battles, whether they be for justice or joy, to create a home that is both sanctuary and headquarters, where love and duty strengthen each other. To face each case, each challenge, each adventure as true partners, knowing that together we are stronger than any force that would stand against us." As they sealed their vows with a kiss, Shadow let out a joyous whinny, making the crowd laugh and cheer. The stallion had found his own happy ending, just as Sarah had found hers, not in submission or surrender, but in the freedom to be wild, and loving both. Later, as they danced under the starlit sky, Sarah caught glimpses of their future in the faces around them. More cases to solve, more wrongs to right, more lives to touch. But now, they would do it together, their love story, becoming part of a larger tale of justice and redemption. In her father's study, the family Bible lay open to their new entry, the ink still drying on its pages, a record not just of a marriage, but of a revolution. One that began with a false scandal and ended with true love changing not just two hearts, but an entire territory's sense of justice.